Now, on 105.9 FM and streaming worldwide on the WMAL app. O'Connor and Company.
It is 5:06 on this Easter Monday in your nation's capital. Thank you for starting your early morning with us here on O'Connor and Company. And if you're just waking up, let us be the first to deliver the news that Pope Francis, the 266th pontiff of the Catholic Church, has passed away into his 12th year, well, actually technically into his 13th year of his papacy. And aren't you lucky you've got two conservative American Catholics to comment on it all morning long? In myself, Larry O'Connor, and my cohort this morning, Julie Gunlock. Good morning, Julie.
Good morning.
We will, in fact, be commenting on that and giving you our personal reflections and reflections on his life. And here's what we're not going to do. The entirety of Pope Francis's pontificate is not going to be shot through the lens of his position on gay marriage and women in the priesthood, because we're not the typical boring, lazy corporate mainstream media. He was a complex man, and he challenged us to examine our beliefs and examine our positions on things, and that's a kind of a cool thing, actually. And there was a lot to him than just gay marriage and women in the priesthood. But it's like every pope now has to be shot through that lens, because that's what the corporate secular Western media does, because that's all they think matters, I guess, these days when it comes to the Catholic Church. Well, there's a lot more to it, in fact, and we'll discuss it. Also at 7:05, Joe DeGeneva on the ridiculous Supreme Court decision to halt deportations, at least temporarily. 7:35, Tim Graham from Media Research Center, and at 8:05, Victoria Cobb. It's Larry O'Connor with, as I said, Julie Gunlock. Well, I mean, let's reflect on it a bit here. So this is bizarre. I was so confused when I woke up this morning. You know how we're a little blurry-eyed, Julie?
Yes.
When you wake up and you check your phone, okay, what happened overnight? And I had seen, first it was like a mini controversy yesterday, because as you know, J.D. Vance has been in Rome. Great images of him with his kids at the Easter Mass. And then there were certain reports that Pope Francis wouldn't meet with J.D. Vance. And of course, first I thought, well, okay, first of all, the guy just got out of hospital and he's 88 years old, and, it's Easter, so it's kind of hard to drop everything to see J.D. Vance. But, and of course, people were reading into that, well, he had written him a sharp rebuke over his J.D. Vance's public position on what was it, Ordo Amore, which is the order of love. You take care of those closest in your family.
Oh, right.
Consicular circles. It's kind of it goes back to Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and such. So, of course, everything Pope Francis does gets politicized, which is understandable, because, sadly, Pope Francis himself dabbled in politics. So, that's what's going to happen. But then later in the day, he did meet with J.D. Vance. I thought I was going to tweet it to you, Julie, yesterday, saying, this American leader did not poop his pants while meeting with the Pope, which is kind of a nice thing, because we're used to Biden doing that.
We are 3 minutes in. Well done, Larry, waiting that long. I've been on the tip of your tongue, I'm sure.
So that was the last thing I saw last night. Is all right, fine, we'll talk about that tomorrow. People trying to make a controversy where it doesn't exist. And then suddenly, the next thing you know, Pope Francis passes away just within hours of meeting with Vice President J.D. Vance.
And J.D. Vance just 13 minutes ago actually tweeted out, he just learned the passing. He said, I just learned of the passing of Pope Francis. My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him. I was happy to see him yesterday, though. He was obviously very ill, but I'll always remember him for the below homily. He attached a homily that the Pope gave in the very early days of COVID. It was really quite beautiful. May God rest his soul. So actually, I'm sorry, that was 24 minutes ago.
Thank you.
Obviously,
that's quite all right.
How strange to have just met with him, and then he dies even 24 hours later.
He had been hospitalized for weeks. He had, people were sort of on the Pope Pope passing watch for quite some time there. With what appeared to be a major case of pneumonia and other complications while he was in the hospital. He was released. He did participate in the Easter Mass, and then he passed away this morning. So rest in peace, Pope Francis. It was he was elected in 2013. And also I noted this weekend was the 20-year anniversary of St. Benedict, Cardinal Ratzinger, being named the successor as pontiff to John Paul II. That 20-year anniversary was this weekend, and of course, famously, Benedict stepped aside and gave up the pontificate, which is a very rare occurrence, to make way for Francis. So a while there, we had a pope and we had a pope emeritus, and because of the nature of that extraordinary event, there was a lot of sort of conspiracy theory around Pope Francis, and that maybe he wasn't the real pope, and maybe that they pushed Benedict out, and maybe we have a fake pope, and it's just insanity.
It's exhausting.
Meredith and I used to refer to it as Pope Anon, like kind of a QAnon situation there, where we know the real truth behind what's going on with the Pope, and not really. He wasn't Here's the problem, I think, with a lot of things. He's a complicated man, and I don't want to get into all of the politics, sadly, but it's impossible to judge his 12-plus years as the Pope without pointing out that, yeah, he was definitely a figure that made us he challenged us in a big way. And I think part of that is because we Catholics or citizens of the world had it really lucky. For close to 30 years, we had two men who I think are saints. Pope John Paul II, bona fide saint, and Pope Benedict, I think, is on his way to being a saint and a doctor of the church. Two brilliant, incredible, consistent, and remarkable men. That's, over the course of the last 2,000 years, that's rare. Most popes are kind of ordinary. Most popes just sort of get the job done, I'm not trying to talk down the position, obviously, but, there are only a handful of popes that really stand out as this is a remarkable figure, and we had two back-to-back. And then Francis wasn't. And I think he was always going to pale in comparison. He also was extraordinary because he was the first one from the Western Hemisphere. He came from Argentina, which was an impoverished nation or had major corruption in its government, had economic woes. He was, I think, he was influenced by his surroundings growing up and his suspicion
Deeply.
Of capitalism.
Yes, deeply.
So he had some Marxist instincts because of who he was and where he grew up, and he brought that to the table when he spoke outside of the confines of his job. And I know that might be confusing to non-Catholics, but when you're a pope, you wear two hats. And by the way, both those hats are super pointy and cool looking. But one of your hats is to sort of be a public spokesperson and public figure, and yes, a statesman and political figure. And in that regard, he did sort of sound like a left-wing liberal climate change kind of weirdo.
No doubt.
But then the other hat he wears, which is really the only important hat that he wears, is to maintain the doctrine and dogmas of the church that we believe was instituted biblically, scripturally, when Jesus gave St. Peter the keys to the kingdom and said that on this rock I will build my church, and we believe that was the church he built. And in that regard, he was actually remarkably consistent. People lose sight of this. But every time there was an opportunity for him to sort of maybe re-examine dogmas, even though you can't really re-examine a dogma, he wouldn't. He held the line. To a very frustrating end, by the way, as a believer, because one thing you want from the teaching office of the Vatican as a Catholic is consistency. And he was inconsistent in his public remarks, and that's what made him a real challenge. I want to get into those details, too, from a personal perspective, if you don't mind, because one of the things he was ambiguous about affects me directly, and it was very frustrating, so I can imagine how other people dealt with this, too. I'll get to it in a second and a little bit more. Sorry, I want you to jump in here, too, because unlike me, Julie, you actually got to meet a pope in your lifetime. I did not meet a pope. You met one of the really good ones, too. So we'll get to that in a little bit more in a moment. But again, the breaking news is that Pope Francis is dead at the age of 88. And by the way, the other part of this story is it's game on in Rome right now. Boy, the wrangling is already happening here about the next pope. We'll get into that, too.
WMAL, making sense of the news. Live from the Home Paramount Pest Control Studios. Home Paramount, the leader in pest control since 1939.
All right, so let me put you on the lookout here as you hear news reported this morning about the passing of Pope Francis. If your news outlet spends all its time saying the Pope dabbled with the idea of changing the church's dogma on women in the priesthood or gay marriage or, fill in the blanks. You're listening to a lazy, uninformed, uneducated outlet, because the fact of the matter is the dogmas of the Catholic Church cannot be changed. Now, how those dogmas are enforced and how that carries out, and he did. He flirted. He never touched women in the priesthood because that was set in stone by John Paul II. That ain't going to change, all right? That's just a dogma of the Church. We believe that was handed down and instituted. The priesthood was instituted by Jesus. You ain't changing what Jesus set up, all right? He did loosen the approach that churches are to take to those who have same-sex attraction, which is the more accurate way of defining the church's position on such things. What Francis said was, yeah, it's a sin. Absolutely. There's a lot of sins out there. And why our church is focused so much on just this one sin and we're not paying attention to the other sin, all sinners are welcome in our church. Nothing wrong with that. That's completely consistent all the way back to Jesus, right? That's a pretty Christian stance. There was confusion over again, it wasn't a doctrine, it wasn't a dogma, but it was guidance for priests about blessing same-sex couples.
Yes, yeah.
And the confusion, again, this is where we get frustrated because you want your church to be consistent in its messaging, and it was confusing. Technically, by the letter of the law, it didn't really change anything. If people come up and ask for a blessing, a priest is to give them a blessing. You don't ask for a confession before you get a blessing. That's the difference between blessing an individual versus blessing a relationship. And the church never said, yes, bless this relationship. But sadly, because it was ambiguous, some really radical priests out there said, look, we can bless same-sex couples now. And they were wrong. And they were disciplined pretty quickly, I think, or most of them.
Yeah.
Or at least corrected. From my own personal perspective, he came really close, I thought, to changing whether a divorced and remarried person in the church could receive communion. He even wrote it in a document. I looked it up here. It was Amoris Laetitia, which is the love life of the laity, basically.
Yeah.
Where it appeared as though he was open to divorced and remarried Catholics receiving communion. And I am in that state, Julie. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting, because I was going to go through the process of an annulment, and I didn't know if I needed to get an annulment. And I can tell you from my personal perspective, it drove me nuts because you couldn't get a straight answer.
Right.
And if you remember, this was pretty early on. You thought that he was going to, now, because that's the kind of thing that the church can. That's not a dogma. That's just sort of the discipline and the custom of the church right now. And part of being Catholic is to follow the teaching of the church.
Sure. If
that's the teaching of the church. And I can tell you, as a divorced and remarried Catholic, that was very frustrating. I have not taken communion in over 10 years. Or about 10 years because of this, and I thought that was going to be changed. It didn't get changed. That's fine. I'm obedient. But just be clear. Make I know you want to be friendly and loving to everybody and say, oh, this is fine, and we welcome you, and we want you to do this. And then he would publicly say in documents like this, maybe we should do this. I was like, no maybes. I stop with the maybe. Just do it. And then he would give these press conferences on the back of his plane to the media and say things that sounded like he was giving church teaching when he wasn't. He was giving his opinion, which is not the same thing, and it just confused. It confused the Catholics, and it certainly confused non-Catholics who used his words to drive a wedge in the church. And so that's, I think, why you get a lot of controversy around this man.
You do, and I think there's also sympathy. Catholics, devout Catholics, want to love the Pope, want to be loyal to the Pope, want to be respectful to the Pope. Boy, it's been tough. It really has been. From his environmental stance to his outward, he has said he's been very critical of capitalism, for instance, and has said, it is a new. He said, capitalism is a new tyranny. Yeah. He said it's an economy of exclusion and inequity. And he hasn't been a good leader on certain things. Like, he's made these sort of milquetoast statements about transgenderism and other things. And I think there's a lot of, I would say, more conservative Catholics who want certainty, like you said, the uncertainty has been frustrating for us, these sort of weak statements. I will say one thing about his so-called Marxism, because he's thought of as a Marxist. Many people consider him a Marxist. He did grow up under under a terrible, where he grew up, where he was born. It was it was a terrible system there, and I think in many cases as a young boy and as a young man, the Marxists were the ones who were thought of as, or the communists were the ones who were thought of as taking care of the poor, right? And so he has some sympathy for this. He says, I found this quote from him: Marxist ideology is wrong, but in my life, I have known many Marxists who are good people, so I don't feel offended.
Right.
That's when he was reacting to being called a Marxist. So I think it is important to remember that he grew up under, very difficult circumstances, and just like Pope John Paul, he grew up in Poland, and that affected ultimately his positions on issues and his positions on the world. So I think a lot of people want to forgive this Pope for some of the, and be gentle and generous with him, because we want to love our Pope.
Especially in passing, and as a result of his passing, I should say, for those of you who are just joining us, the Pope Francis has passed away in the Vatican, and but again, that's a perfect example. It's like I know a lot of Marxists, and they're perfectly fine human beings.
Yes. That's a very Oprah look at the world. Yes,
but the Catholic Church, going back to Pope Leo XIII,
that's right. Yep,
has condemned communism. Yep. And said that socialism, including Marxism and its Marxist forms, violates the principle of human freedom and the Church's social teaching. That's in the Catechism right now. So it's like, communism and Marxism violates the Church's teaching. That said, there are a lot of people that violate Church's teaching, and they're fine people.
Yeah. Again, It was sort of, when he would make these kind of statements, it was sort of the Oprah. I always talk about the Oprahfication of the world. Like, we're all, it's like toxic levels of empathy, and like we've just become. This was a perfect Pope for our day and age.
Yeah, sort of exactly. I'd like I'm hoping for a Pope that's perfect for every day and age, that transcends the times that we're living in right now, and that's the challenge that the conclave will have now. And trust me, it's not going to be like that movie. I sure hope it won't be like the ending of that movie, at least. Game on in Rome, as there will be jockeying, and this is going to be a hell of a story to track over the course of the next couple of weeks. Pope Francis, dead at the age of 88.
Now, on 105.9 FM and streaming worldwide on the WMAL app, O'Connor and Company.
And as the world awakes, at least here on the Western Hemisphere, we awake to the news that Pope Francis passed away this morning at the age of 88 on Easter Monday. He actually surprised the faithful yesterday by driving through the awaiting crowds there outside St. Peter's Basilica. He looked frail. He's been sick, but he didn't look like he was on the edge of death, but he has passed away. We're getting statements in from Vice President J.D. Vance, who just met with him in Rome literally hours ago. The Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni of Italy, has just put out a statement in the last hour, and will continue to relay the world messages to you and our own analysis of what kind of pope he was and, well, what's going to happen next. In fact, starting at 6:05, we'll hear from Raymond Arroyo, who's the managing editor at EWTN. That's the Global Catholic Network, started right here in the United States. It's 7:05, Joe DeGeneva. It's 7:35, Tim Graham Media Research Center. And 8:05, Victoria Cobb of the Family Foundation. It's Larry O'Connor with Julie Gunlock. Julie, you got to meet one of the best popes, the greatest popes, literally St. John Paul the Great.
Yes.
You met him in the Vatican.
I did. It's so funny. Today is actually my 24-year anniversary, wedding anniversary.
Well, happy anniversary to
thank
you.
you.
That's very impressive.
And for our honeymoon, we went to Rome, and very few people know about this, but the Vatican, and still does, this blessing of the brides. Mm-hmm. If you go to Rome within a year of your wedding, you can meet the Pope. He has an audience with all the new brides, right? But it's also obviously grooms as well. And we went.
Not
we
that
sat
they matter
outside.
much. Yes.
we did the mass outside, and then the brides and grooms are brought up to meet the Pope, and I met Pope John Paul right there. It was incredible in Rome at St. Peter's Basilica. So it was an incredible moment.
And you get back into your wedding dress for that.
Yes,
meeting,
you wear
right,
your
for the Pope?
yes, you wear your wedding dress. I'll tweet out a picture. You wear your wedding
I've
dress.
seen that,
Yeah, and it was an incredible moment. And he was so beautiful. Pope John Paul was so beautiful, and he was actually really excited to see people from the United States. There was also there were about, I think, like 20 couples there that day, and there was a Polish couple. And I'll never forget, he was particularly excited to see the Polish couple. So anyway, lots of Italians were there.
It's very cool. Although I have to say, it's such a faux pas because, you're not supposed to wear white at a wedding. Just let the bride wear white. And yet the Pope consistently has to wear white. So it's like, come
kind
on,
of a
dude.
faux pas there. Yeah.
A bit of a one. I got to see Pope Benedict but not like you did. I was down in the square with the rest of the rabble, and he was up on the balcony delivering his Friday address, is it, or Wednesday address? That was pretty cool. Very tiny man. But what a giant intellect.
Absolutely.
Pope Francis has passed away, and interestingly, for much of the faithful, you remember we talk about how James Comey, as the FBI director, Christopher Wray, as FBI director, oversaw this abomination of an investigation and pursuit of traditional conservative Catholics who were attending Latin Mass. Francis was incredibly hostile to those who wanted to attend the Latin Mass mostly here in America, but in other areas. The Novus Ordo, which is the order of Mass that was instituted post-Vatican II in the late 60s, early 70s, is a fine order of the Mass. Sadly, though, too many dioceses, especially in the West, have had the freedom to sort of add some contemporary music that isn't always aesthetically pleasing and sort of tweak some of they've been given the freedom to tweak some of the areas of the rite to make it a little bit, frankly, a little bit less reverent and a little bit less contemplative. And that has actually, as is typical, created a hunger for a more traditional, more grounded, and much more serious, solemn occasion when one goes to Mass. So there was a resurgence in interest in that, and Francis didn't like that a certain portion of conservatives who embraced that were also, and he's not wrong about this, were also outspoken against some of the other things that the church was trying to loosen up in terms of its approach to certain Catholic doctrines. Francis conflated the two and just decided, we got to stop the Latin Mass, which never made sense to me. It's like, if you have a problem with, because he always said there's nothing wrong with the Latin Mass, and by the way, it's not outlawed or anything. It's not like it's an invalid Mass. He just put more restrictions on which bishops could allow it to occur, and less freedom for churches to be able to do it. Hopefully the new pope will come and approach this in a much more congenial way.
I go to a church that does a lovely Latin Mass every weekend, and we went to, my goodness, you want a Mass that is hard for little kids to get through. We went to the Latin Mass on Easter yesterday.
Bells and smells, they like to say. Lots of bells and smells.
And I just could not stop thinking about the little kid, because there was a lot of crying. It's a lot. It was about an hour and a half Mass, so it was longer than the average. But beautiful, beautiful. So meaningful.
Well, I assure you, the Baptists in our audience are like, hour and a half? That's just, what's that? That's just one sermon. Come on. What's the problem with that? We're used to our 60 minutes in and out, because at Catholic churches we have like 4 or 5 masses a Sunday, on your typical Sunday morning, not to mention on an Easter where it's going to be overflowing. We went to a very nice Novus Ordo, just with contemporary music, but it was done exquisitely reverently. The Novus Ordo Mass in vernacular, in English or whatever we have. Our vernacular happens to be English, but there was no Latin there at all, and it was lovely. You can do that Mass in a very reverent and respectful way. The problem is many do not. And there is a hunger right now, I think, especially in the West, for something grounded, more traditional,
Yes.
more reverent, and because so much in our secular world isn't. And young people in particular, in fact, we talked about this last week, that there is this resurgence in new Catholics being baptized this Easter, breaking records in many Western parishes, which is sort of, ironically, a backlash to the liberalization that Francis championed.
Yeah, it's very funny. The women in my church, and I said I go to this rather conservative church, has this lovely Latin mass every weekend, but the women are veiling now.
Yes.
in mass, and the ones that are veiling are generally about 10, 15 years younger than me.
Yeah.
The older women some of the older women are, but it's interesting because I did not grow up with that. I definitely grew up in a kumbaya Catholic church in the Midwest.
Me both. Yes.
Yeah, guitars and the whole bit. And so it's very interesting to see these young women with babies on their hips, and they're all veiled.
Yep, all the trad Catholics.
Yeah,
and
I love it.
And that should be embraced. It's exciting. And by the way, there's a whole new resurgence in the priesthood as well. And there was a survey showing that something like 98% of the new priests are all very, very conservative. Not that crop of sort of soft 70s, 80s sort of liberal priests that we're all suffering through their homilies right now.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on in the church, and it's as sad as it is to see Pope Francis pass away, this is a chance for a new beginning. And what that conclave might look like, we'll talk to Raymond Arroyo at 6:05 about that. It's a dominant story today. Of course, there's American politics. Don't worry, we'll get to plenty of that, but we'll reflect a little bit more on the passing of Pope Francis coming up in a moment. It's 5:44.
WMAL, making sense of social media, because big tech can't be trusted. Download the WMAL app to stream us for free.
As I said, Raymond Arroyo, managing editor of EWTN, is going to join us coming up at 6:05, but just a little bit more as we're getting more reactions from world leaders on the passing of Pope Francis. If you're just joining us, Pope Francis dead at the age of 88. And now it's I hate to put it this way, but it's game on. This is a political process. It's an election. There's a vote. The conclave will be commenced probably right after the funeral. There's going to be a very elaborate funeral for Pope Francis, and then the cardinals will go right from that funeral, if this is like the last couple of times, and go right into the conclave in the Sistine Chapel, where they will discuss and they'll debate and they'll vote, and at some point we'll see the white smoke and we'll have a pope. What do you think that now? That also should be pointed out that the conclave is going to be very much made up of cardinals that Pope Francis has selected.
Yes. Well, I saw the movie Conclave, so I am an expert.
Yeah, get ready for that for the next 2 months.
I hear there'll be lots of intrigue and and sort of rumors of murders and things like that. No, this will be a fun process. To watch. Obviously, behind closed doors, we will not know what goes on, and we will all be on smoke watch. Imagine all the, the news, the cable news networks love this. They're gonna, set up their stages and have all their, morning shows from probably Rome. It's like they sort of it's the same way they treat royal weddings, right? So this will be interesting to watch. Sadly, I don't know. I know you sort of follow this a lot closer, Larry, but I don't know who the sort of leading contenders are, and I'm sure we'll talk to Raymond about that. But
yeah. Well, ask Raymond. I think that I can tell you this, one of the fastest growing and most dynamic areas of the world for Christianity right now in the Catholic Church is Africa.
That's right. It's time for an African pope, right?
Well, timing again. We've had African
I know.
In fact, yes. Augustine famously was from North Africa.
Yeah, you always correct me with that. Okay,
he worked out pretty good, yeah. The early church, of course, the early spread of the church was in Turkey and Greece and Rome, but then also in North Africa. And If they do pick an African pope, that's a signal that they're going conservative, because that's where the conservatives are right now in the church.
Well, one interesting thing about
you'll have to hold it for later.
We are.
There it is. It's 5:53.